Resume in public session. The purpose of our engagement this morning is to begin our consideration of the issues of community policing and rural crime. It is anticipated that today's session will focus primarily on the first aspect, but we're not locked into that by any means. Witnesses are welcome to address the topic of rural crime in conjunction with community policing as they so wish. Of course, the topics are not mutually exclusive. We are joined this morning by Dr. Johnny Connolly of the School of Law of the University of Limerick. You're very welcome here this morning. And Johnny has also been a member of the Commission on the Future of Policing. From Laoghaire, we have Miss Bernie Mealy, who is the Area Manager of the South East region, and Miss Kaylee Canning, who is the Senior Youth Officer, and you're both very welcome here this morning. And we're also the Senior Youth Officer with the Garda Youth Diversion Project to have the full detail. And from Winchester na Tíre, we have Mr. Michael Sweeney, who is the President, and Mr. Niall, the Chief Executive, and you're both very welcome here today from Winchester na Tíre. So, at the outset, I have to read the privilege reminder to all our guests, and I have to draw your attention to the situation in relation to privilege. So, please note that you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or it identifiable. And members of the Justice and Equality Committee should be aware that under the salient rulings of the Chair, members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So, with all that said, I would now like to invite you in the order in which I've introduced you. I hope that that's okay. And so I will invite Dr. Johnny Connolly to make his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll talk mostly about the idea of community policing, although I'm happy to answer questions on rural crime as well. Obviously, in my role with the Commission, we got a lot of submissions on the issue of rural crime. And of course, rural communities also have a role to perform in terms of policing their communities with the guards and other participants. Community policing is a philosophy of policing that promotes community-based problem-solving strategies to address the underlying causes of crime and disorder and fear of crime, and which provides reassurance. Many community policing approaches involve the police performing a role in addressing community problems which may not be directly related to crime. Problem-solving policing reorientates the police role away from an exclusive focus on the crime. Problems, not crime, become the organising core of police activity. The concern is with preventing future harm. Similarly, solutions can be broader than simple law enforcement and involve the participation of other agencies such as housing or health agencies. Furthermore, the criminal law becomes only one means of addressing problems. Civil laws can be utilised, planning regulations, or increasingly mediation and restorative justice schemes can have a role to play. Problem-solving policing requires analysis of the causes of the problem, identification of the options open to addressing it, and then the development of a means of evaluation of the impact of the problem so as to assess performance. Such an approach requires partnership between the police, the community and other relevant agencies. Through partnership structures, communities seek involvement in decision-making and problem-solving. Community policing in this way involves community empowerment. It also has implications for the police in terms of structural change. To be effective, such an approach requires devolution of power within the police organisation and the decentralisation of police authority to patrol officers, and a far greater emphasis on collaboration between police and community. The community policing approach emphasises ideas of consumer service, flexibility, consumer feedback and negotiation. Finally, this change in the police role necessitates training to enhance police understanding of the nature of community problems and for the development of problem-solving techniques. This was described in the report of the Independent Commission on Policing for Northern Ireland, the Patent Report, as the need for more focus on developing personal communication and negotiation skills, scenario-based problem-solving exercises, self-assessment and peer assessment. Also, community policing approaches require a change in the way police effectiveness is measured. The number of arrests or prosecutions are crude measurements, and to fully assess community policing approaches requires more qualitative measurements such as problem resolutions, but also community-oriented expectations and defined objectives. Throughout the world, there is a great variety of community policing models and approaches. Despite this variety, a number of common characteristics define the community policing philosophy. These are flexibility of police structure, devolution of authority within the police and development of localised command structures, creations of systems of local accountability, community crime prevention schemes, an increase in the number of foot patrols, cultivation of police-community relations through continuity of service by officers in a specific area over a prolonged period, problem-solving of non-crime issues, partnership between police and public, power sharing between community and police over decision-making. There is no single model of community policing, but the philosophy is strongly linked to the concepts of localised democracy, policing by consent, based on respect for fundamental human rights. It also requires the entire police force to adopt a broader concept of policing and a transformation of the mindset of all police officers. Many submissions received by the Commission on the Future of Policing highlighted broad public support from both outside and inside An Garda Síochána for better community policing. At present, community policing is very informal and dependent on the personal commitment of local management to this form of policing and the level of support provided. Other criticisms made of community policing include the following. The diversion of resources to other duties would appear to vary significantly within the force. The lack of available records to quantify this in itself is an issue of concern. There is a considerable lack of supporting infrastructure for community policing units. The work and outcome of the work undertaken by community Gardaí is inappropriately measured, if at all. There is no clear command structure. The activities community police or the community policing structures are not sufficiently formalised within the organisation. Community policing is under-resourced. It does not have a proper career path or equality of status with respect to working conditions and allowances. Community policing personnel are moved to other policing units when the need arises, such as for sporting events or temporary transfer deals in response to pressure on policing resources, and this breaks down continuity in community police service. The programme for recruiting suitable members to community policing is ill-conceived. Community police do not receive adequate training in conflict resolution, problem solving or communication skills. There is often no specific space to do such basic things as conduct meetings or receive telephone calls. In summary, in Ireland, as in many countries, community policing within our police organisation is marginalised and undervalued. We have extensive evidence of this, and yet the one constant theme running through most submissions to the Commission on the Future of Policing, particularly from within An Garda Síochána, is the need for community policing to be central. The Commission has articulated a vision of policing into the future that puts community policing at its core. The Commission has made radical proposals that will transform the way in which policing is delivered to local communities. The term community policing is used in many different ways, but in the report of the Commission we use the term district policing, which we consider to be the best fit for Irish circumstances and for the new model that is proposed. In the current approach, community policing is a kind of special activity, with perhaps 10% of Gardaí in a district designated as community police. We regard district policing as the backbone of police work and the police mission. In our new district policing model, all police personnel at district level, sworn and non-sworn, should be considered to be community police. In future, all Garda personnel at district level, whether sworn or non-sworn, and whether assigned to emergency response or community engagement, should work as a single district policing team to solve problems affecting community safety, reduce crime and prevent harm. They should develop their own district policing plans, consulting with local community fora. They should be equipped to deliver all routine policing services with support from the divisional level for administration and certain specialist functions. The structure of An Garda Síochána should reflect the focus on the front line by becoming flatter and less siloed. Headquarters should set policies, broad strategy, standards and objectives. Frontline police units should decide how they can best deliver those objectives and be accountable to the supervisors for the outcomes. There must be a high degree of delegated authority, complemented by stronger local supervision, notably at sergeant and inspector level. Innovation, initiative and new approaches should be encouraged and evidence-based success applauded and disseminated. Excellence on the front line should be valued and recognised. Building of genuine community partnerships should be a requirement for all Garda districts. To be effective in preventing crime and protecting people from harm, police must work in partnership with other entities, including schools, community and voluntary organisations, businesses, human rights NGOs, youth groups, faith groups, sporting bodies and others. We've seen evidence of good examples of this around the country, but the practice should be universal and police leaders should be assessed on their success in building such partnerships. Gardaí should be assessed for their performance in this respect, and it should be a factor in determining assignments and promotions. Supporting the district will be the division level units. These should be large enough to be self-sufficient for all routine administrative and operational purposes. They should also have detective teams and other specialists to support the districts. Crisis intervention teams, including staff from mental health and child service agencies, should be based at division level. Each division should have an information centre supporting the districts in data collection and analysis. In effect, we envisage that a division should be, for most policing purposes, a mini police service in its own right. The current 28 divisions seem to us to be too many and too small. We are not more prescriptive about the structure because we believe firmly that the Commissioner must be allowed to manage the organisation, and that includes deciding on the right structure. We do believe that it should be flatter than it is now, with a lower senior management ratio. It is also important that there should be effective fora for police to engage with communities at district level. In the new model for district policing, we envisage that district police leaders would develop local policing plans based on local objectives and priorities agreed with joint policing committees or local community policing fora, involving full community participation. Currently, the Policing Authority has responsible to coordinate and support the JPCs. It has not had the same role in respect of local community policing fora. We propose that the new oversight body, the Policing and Community Safety Oversight Commission, which will supersede the Policing Authority and Garda Inspectorate, should develop these local structures to function effectively, building capacity for participation by community stakeholders, setting standards for their operation and evaluating their performance. The key objective will be to build community trust and address problems through authentic engagement. PCSOC should also work with local fora to promote multi-agency approaches to community safety at the local level. It should have a fund available to support local innovation and initiatives. The public, police and politicians all told the Commission that they want to see more police on the front line. We agree. More police working in and with the community will help prevent and detect crime, reduce fear of crime and protect people at risk. Many police are now doing jobs that do not require police powers and should be done by non-sworn employees or outsourced. Police also have unnecessary administrative duties such as keeping paper records, duplicating electronic ones. These should be stopped. These steps will allow significant numbers of Gardaí to be redeployed to frontline district duties. The Commission has heard repeatedly throughout our consultations that An Garda Síochána is constantly called upon to engage in non-crime roles, many of which perhaps could be conducted by other agencies. However, it has to be acknowledged too that the professional police everywhere are often both the first port of call, in that people go to them because they don't know where else to go and are then directed elsewhere, or they are the last port of call, as there are no other sources locally available or accessible due to being in the evening. The police are also unique in the extent of their extensive legal powers, which can be called upon at any time in the conduct of their general or specific roles, or when a non-crime issue becomes a crime issue. It is also very important to note that An Garda Síochána, like all professional police, have very significant symbolic power in society. The professional police remain qualitatively different from other forms of policing in its symbolic power, generalist mission and regulatory position. The key task for the Commission was to identify how this unique position can best be utilised for the benefit of those most dependent on it, which primarily are the most vulnerable in society. A January 15 report by the UK College of Policing estimating demand on the police service found that 84% of calls to the police were related to non-crime incidents, notably concerns over an individual's welfare. Theresa May told the Police Federation conference in May 2005, when she was then Home Secretary, that police officers were not social workers, mental health nurses or paramedics. In reality, however, they often are all of these things. Are they at least on an amateur basis, and unless other professional bodies who perform these roles engage or are available and accessible? An Garda Síochána will continue to perform such functions until that happens, and we have made recommendations to how this should occur. District police should have real-time access to crime data and to information about public concerns. They should keep their residents well informed about community safety issues and engage with them proactively to solve problems affecting crime and the perception of crime, thereby leading to both the reduction of crime and stronger confidence in community safety. Frontline police are a vital source of information about crime, fear of crime and vulnerabilities in the communities they serve. Finally, An Garda Síochána should reflect the diversity of Irish society in terms of socio-economic status, gender and ethnicity. This will take a determined effort, including innovative marketing of the police career and youth engagement initiatives on the lines of Police Explorer programmes elsewhere. It is also recommended in the report that the organisation should work with higher education institutions to develop a Garda Access programme aligned with the programmes of those institutions. In conclusion, there is a historic challenge and opportunity facing us in terms of the future of policing. As we move to the centenary of the establishment of An Garda Síochána, how to transform our policing model from the highly centralised and hierarchical colonial model we have inherited to a community policing model with all that the latter entails. The Commission has set down a transformative vision whereby the philosophy, principles and processes that define policing with the community can be effectively delivered in an Irish context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Connolly, and appreciate that very much indeed. Very comprehensive opening statement. So I'd now like to invite, I'm not sure what way you want to order it, but it's Bernie first,
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And I'd like to invite Bernie to address us now on behalf of Foróige.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting Foróige to speak at this joint committee on justice and equality. Today I too will be focusing on our experience of community policing. So to give you a bit of context, Foróige is a national youth development organisation whose purpose is to involve young people consciously and actively in their own development and the development of society. This is carried out through a range of supports, from universal volunteer-led clubs to targeted interventions engaging with some of the most vulnerable and at-risk young people and families in their communities. Our primary experience with community policing is through the provision of Garda Youth diversion projects. So there are 105 Garda Youth diversion projects nationally, managed by a range of community-based organisations. Funded by the Irish Youth Justice Service, Garda Youth diversion projects are community-based, multi-agency youth crime prevention initiatives, which seek primarily to divert young people involved in crime, criminal or antisocial behaviour away from the criminal justice system, by providing suitable activities to facilitate personal development, promote civic responsibility and improve long-term employability prospects. Foróige manages 42 GYDPs nationally and is also funded by the Irish Youth Justice Service to provide a range of supports to Garda Youth diversion projects through the GYDP Best Practice team. The Community Policing Service provides a vital support to many of the young people, families and communities that we work with. Community Gardaí actively contribute to the diversion of young people from offending or further offending. This is done through building positive, trusting relationships in the community, engaging in partnerships with local agencies, both voluntary and statutory, and by being visible and accessible. The role of Community Gardaí in the early intervention and prevention of youth crime should not be underestimated. Children and young people tend to follow a pathway towards offending behaviour. There are also characteristics which make it possible to predict the likelihood of a young person engaging in offending. These developmental pathways and characteristics give families, communities and systems the opportunity to intervene and prevent the onset of criminal and antisocial behaviour, while also building skills, strengths and resilience in young people. Focusing on the development of assets and strengths in young people while reducing the risks not only delivers positive outcomes for young people and families, but also contributes to the overall quality of life in a community and reduces the likelihood of escalation of a young person's offending behaviour, thus reducing the burden of crime on society and the significant financial costs associated with that. The research has clearly evidenced that the more contact a young person has with the justice system, the poorer their outcomes. It is important to intervene as soon as possible and as little as possible with the young person who is at risk of offending to bring about a change in their behaviour. Through their presence on the ground, Community Gardaí can monitor behaviour and identify young people who may be at risk of offending before their behaviour escalates to the point where they come to the attention of their other Garda colleagues. Quite often, the Community Gardaí will deal with incidents of antisocial behaviour in an informal manner with the young person, and this low level of intervention is enough to have a positive impact on their behaviour. Where a young person or family may require a greater level of intervention, the interagency approach of the Community Policing Service allows for Community Gardaí to make timely referrals to appropriate services which can meet the needs of the young people and their families. GYDPs have greatly benefited from the relationship with Community Gardaí, particularly in relation to early intervention with young people. The partnership approach of the Community Gardaí has also been effective in identifying young people under the age of criminal responsibility who may be engaging in risky or antisocial behaviour. This has ensured that the appropriate supports are put in place for those young people under 12 years and has allowed us to address their needs and risks at an earlier stage, using their strengths and interests to build skills, increase protective factors and reduce the likelihood of future offending. Engagement with Community Gardaí has allowed for frank, informed conversations in allowing us to monitor behaviour, respond quickly and appropriately and ensure better outcomes for young people. Community Gardaí contribute to youth projects and services and other community agencies in a wide variety of ways. By sitting on local committees, they can contribute to a coordinated response to meeting community needs. Community Gardaí in many areas support GYDPs to develop a comprehensive analysis of youth crime in their catchment area, using both pulse data and local knowledge, which ensures that plans are designed which meet the specific needs of the community and take into account the nuances of their own particular context. Across the country, Community Gardaí are involved in delivering a range of educational programmes in both the school and community settings. These ensure that young people and communities are aware of their rights and responsibilities, but also build trust and relationships between community members and An Garda Síochána. It has been our experience that Community Gardaí have accompanied youth justice workers on visits to families experiencing chaos and trauma. They have engaged with both mainstream and high-risk young people in positive, meaningful and non-judgmental manner, and have responded quickly and sensitively to young people and families in crisis. In a police force where there is a level of mistrust in many communities, the Community Gardaí are the exception. As the visible, approachable and friendly face of An Garda Síochána, many young people and community members will reach out for help and advice from the person that they've met at a local meeting, in the school corridor, in the community centre or walking through their estate before they will ever consider going to the local Garda station. The ability to access the support of the Community Gardaí has benefited many communities enormously from both the crime prevention and quality of life perspective. Those in the Community Policing Service have managed to build positive, effective working relationships with the community, voluntary and statutory agencies working in partnership with them, but equally, if not more importantly, they have built positive personal relationships with community members, young and old. With the many benefits outlined above, it has been disappointing to see the gradual erosion of community policing across the country over the past number of years. Many Garda districts and divisions do not have a dedicated community policing service, which results in a system which is constantly firefighting and responding to issues as they arise, rather than proactively engaging in crime prevention and reduction measures. Where Community Gardaí are present in communities, the benefits are tangible. However, with a reduction in resources and an increased demand, we have seen many Community Gardaí pulled out of community duties in response to frontline operational needs. The prioritisation of regular policing duties has resulted in a loss of the preventative work of relationship building within communities. Many Community Gardaí who have retired or moved position have not been replaced. We have seen first-hand the challenges for Community Gardaí who wish to have a greater level of engagement with communities, but because of the demands placed upon them, can only engage now in an ad hoc manner. Many communities are suffering as a result of the reduction in resources put into community policing. Where present, community policing plays a significant role in crime prevention. In our experience with Garda Youth diversion projects, the benefits in terms of targeting, early intervention, assessment of risk and need, and achieving positive outcomes for young people are clear. Community Gardaí identify young people at risk before they have been detected offending, often under the age of criminal responsibility. They support youth justice workers to carry out assessments, engage with young people and families through the projects, and deal with issues informally at a local level before they escalate. They support interventions in very practical ways, as well as providing advice, support, information and educational programmes. Their partnership approach with community groups and other voluntary and statutory agencies ensures that community needs can be responded to in a coordinated and consistent manner, leading to better outcomes for young people, families and communities. The main challenges that we see are the lack of resources put into community policing over the last few years, the fact that many areas do not have a service, and where there is a service, community Gardaí are often directed to prioritise frontline operational duties to the detriment of their community duties. Because of the vital role they play in early intervention and crime prevention, Oireachtas strongly advocates that appropriate and adequate community policing resources should be allocated in every Garda division and district so that all communities can benefit from the service. Oireachtas welcomes the new community policing framework and the establishment of the new community policing offices in the 28 Garda divisions. We believe that this is a positive development and are hopeful that it will support the allocation of appropriate resources to this essential community service.
Bernie, thank you for that, and thank you to Oireachtas for their presentation here this morning. Our next presenters are Donnchadh and is it Niall is leading off, Michael? Niall, you're in the hot seat.
Members, you have our statement in front of you, and you will be glad to hear I don't intend to read all of it. If I start with the overview, Donnchadh has operated Community Alert for over 30 years in partnership with Garda Síochána. Community Alert is the largest crime prevention initiative in Ireland, with over 1,400 groups. While relying on the age-old principle of neighbours watching out for each other, Community Alert has also been quick to utilise modern tools such as text alert. Statistics show that levels of rural crime are not increasing in general. However, any levels of crime can be reduced. A very real issue in rural areas is the fear of crime. This does not always relate directly to actual crime levels. For instance, whenever there is a high-profile crime, or indeed reporting of a court case relating to a particularly heinous crime from several years earlier, we notice an increase in activity in community alert groups. While crime obviously has rural and urban dimensions, the fear is a much greater factor in rural areas. This is because of isolation. When a person does not have an immediate neighbour, they are obviously more afraid of what might happen to them, whether anybody will come to their aid, and indeed when they might be discovered. Cases of elderly people being tortured, robbed and left tied up are thankfully rare, but they do occur and further fuel these fears. Therefore, crime prevention and detection are important, but equally important is creating an environment that feels safe. Donnchadh and Community Alert provide a vital role in providing this safe environment through means such as Text Alert, the new mobile app Cordja, and supporting other schemes such as the Seniors Alert Scheme. While communities can do a lot for themselves, they still need improved support from Garda Síochána and the judicial and legislative bodies. Donnchadh has a memorandum of understanding with Garda Síochána for the operation of Community Alert. This partnership, which also includes our funders, the Department of Justice and Equality and the HSE, works well. It has allowed for efficient and effective solutions to problems such as the recently introduced Text Alert Rebate Scheme. It should continue to be the platform for providing solutions to rural crime and community safety. The area of community policing is vital in providing this support. In the years of financial restraint from 2008, community policing has been hit particularly hard, locally and centrally. When resources were limited, the Community Garda was often the first role to be hit, as resources were directed towards what were thought to be more urgent areas. This has had the effect of damaging the relationship between communities and Garda Síochána. This needs to be rebuilt urgently. I will leave you to read in your own good time the history and structure of Community Alert and how it operates. But if I could move on to page 8 and Community Text Alert. Community Text Alert was formally launched as a community alert programme in 2013 in partnership with IFA Neighbourhood Watch and Donnghaile Síochána. It has certainly caught the public imagination. Over 700 groups have registered for this initiative in this time, and it receives regular positive media attention. Currently, well over 1 million texts per annum are being issued. Text Alert is often quoted as having provided the vital cog in crime detection, and local Garda management often point to reduced crime in areas where Text Alert is properly implemented. Text Alert areas are highly visible through the erection of highly visible and identifiable signage. This signage includes the telephone number of the nearest 24-hour Garda station to which suspicious activity can be reported. On receipt of such a call, the Gardaí will verify the information and can then issue an SMS text to all registered recipients in the area. There is also the option to include surrounding areas where this might be useful, e.g. with a moving vehicle. The success of Text Alert is due to the fast and efficient dispersal of information between communities and the Gardaí. There is also a deterrent effect through the visible signage. However, equally effective, although less obvious, benefits arise through the very organisation of Text Alert groups. Volunteers visiting houses to explain and gather numbers, neighbours watching out for older or more vulnerable neighbours, etc. The last 12 months have seen much change in Text Alert, with Donnchadh having had to take over the role as the main issuer of texts, and also with new technology being introduced. Our new mobile app, Cord, is an example of this. And I might finally skip to the community policing section on page 10. Policing in Ireland is famous for its reliance on the support of communities and the public at large. In previous decades, most rural communities had a resident Garda. This changed because of the financial constraints since 2008. Many rural Garda stations were closed. It was explained that resources could be better used by having more Gardaí on patrol rather than sitting in a station. It was promised that a community engagement would continue, but using such resources as Gardaí being available at certain times in public buildings, such as community centres. This never happened to any great extent. During the same period, as resources tightened in Garda districts, one of the first casualties in many was the community Garda. These were reassigned to roles that were seen as more pressing. While this might have been necessary in the very short term, it has had a long-term impact. Most people do not now know a local Garda, and this has serious implications for fear of crime and indeed for the passing of information to Donnghaile Síochána. Text Alert has alleviated this somewhat, but this is currently a one-way communication tool. Note that this change primarily affected rural communities. Greater numbers in urban communities meant community engagement could continue to a great extent. During the same period, resources for community policing at a central level were also severely cut. The Garda Relations Office has reduced in numbers to now having only one sergeant responsible for the entire country. While we appreciate his help and work very well together, this severely curtails what can be achieved in our partnership. And I might just add in there, it's not in the statement, but historically in working with the Community Relations Bureau, they would have had one inspector, 2 sergeants, 2 Gardaí and 2 admin workers, and that, as I say, is now one person. These inadequate resources coupled with the Garda management structure hinder the central dissemination of best practice. This leads to practical difficulties in areas such as Text Alert. None of this is a criticism of individual Gardaí with whom we have an excellent working relationship. It is simply the end result of inadequate resources. We would like to see increased resources at a central level. We would also like to see a return to each community having an allocated Garda who is known to the community. We appreciate these are operational matters outside of the direct control of this committee or indeed the department itself. However, we believe the issues must be highlighted. In this regard, we welcome the recent report of the Commission of the Future of Policing in Ireland, particularly in relation to district policing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Niall. On behalf of Donnchadh, and we thank you also for the very comprehensive written submission that you've given to us. Before opening it up, it's only just as a courtesy just to say to you, this is to be the substantive work address of this committee in the period of this session of the Dáil, and we will be meeting next week, just for your information, with representatives of Donnghaile Síochána and the PSNI. It's a first coming before this committee on this dual focus of community policing and rural crime, and we'll be finishing up the following week meeting with representatives of the Irish Farmers Association and the Irish Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association. So We very much appreciate all of your making yourselves available and engaging with us. I have 3 deputies indicating at this point: Deputy Colm, Brophy, Deputy Donnchadh and Deputy Clare Daly. And anyone else who wishes to indicate, I'll add you to the list, but I'll open it up to Deputy Colm Brophy first, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming in to us today. I don't really have that many questions for you in relation to what you said, because I would have very strong agreement with the gist of your presentation to us today. I would certainly support the whole emphasis, and I would hope now that the new Garda authorities would look at the role and the advocacy of community policing and being at the heart of policing. In terms of my experience as a public representative, both as a TD and as a councillor for 10 years beforehand, the community policing, the community Garda really was at the heart of the interaction between the community and the Gardaí. Luckily enough, in my area, we didn't suffer so much of a loss in the community Garda area. It was a thing that was maintained and throughout even the cutbacks, and I think really is the most effective way in which the Gardaí have in dealing with crime in a way, in a manner that actually prevents it escalating to more serious crime. I would say one thing that's not, it was mentioned by yourself, Mr. Connolly, and I think it is a very valid point. If you don't have a structure in place that focuses on a career path for community policing, then really that's at the heart of why I think it encounters problems, because what I have seen over the 10-15 years is that a lot of young Gardaí come into it. They do it for a period of time. They actually, from talking to them and engaging with them, they really seem to like the role. But inevitably, they move on to do something else. They move up or they move out of it, and it leaves the existing structure of the community Garda policing structure, as distinct, say, from what was advocated in your report. It leaves it, I believe, a system that, while it has some very, very good points, is not really effective community policing, because it's really only engagement at one level with the community. And there's a little bit of it which I've experienced through the JPC in my own local authority that really does show that there is a much better path that involves that interaction of Garda management at all levels, higher levels, way up the line, and when that can be put in place. So it's just really to welcome the proposals that you've made today, I really think they're exactly where we should be going. From my own experience of working with Garda management in Tallaght and Rathfarnham, etc., who really have worked with South Dublin County Council on the community policing model. That's the role. That really is where you can be effective. So thank you all very much today. I'd be interested in your comment on that thing about the promotion aspect of it, and whether you think it's at the heart of the problem at the moment.
Thank you, Deputy Brophy. Mr. Conley.
Yeah, I think it's central. It's central to it that one of the things that was very striking throughout the work of the Commission was that when we spoke to guards, we went all around the country meeting guards in their stations, and they all saw themselves as community guards, and they all valued that as the priority of what they were doing. Serving the community is the way they put it. But the problem was that the structures and processes to facilitate that, being at the core of the policing organisation, weren't there. And so they felt it was undervalued, and they believed their colleagues felt it was undervalued. So the objective would be to get into a specialist unit or whatever. That would be the way you'd want to go. Whereas for many of them, they were actually happy in the community police, working at a community policing level. But if they had a career path, if they were promoted on the basis of the way in which they engaged with communities and with local structures, etc., then it would be seen as a lot more important to the organisation.
Okay, Deputy Brophy. Thank you, Dr. Courtney. The next is Deputy Donnchadh, please.
I suppose I Colm, I have a fair number of questions. I was anxious that this issue was something that we addressed. I'm a big fan of the community policing model, where it operates properly. I think it's something that, certainly in my experience, has made a big difference in some of the communities that I represent. We've had some excellent community Gardaí, but I think it is an issue that's been neglected. I put down a number of PQs earlier this year, and across the country the number of dedicated community Gardaí is down by 40%, but it's much larger than in some areas. It's down by 94% in Donnghaile. Some of that's, you know, due to the fact that maybe some chief supers were in a position to better defend their resources and so on, and to keep people on. But in every district, I would say there was a significant fall, and in some districts there was a catastrophic fall. I suppose that brings me just on to just a general observation, specifically for you, Johnny, but others can offer a view as well. And I suppose my first few questions are for you, and it reflects what's in the Commission on the Future Policing document. And part of me wonders whether it's an issue in relation to language, because I think, you know, people who haven't necessarily, community policing sounds vague unless you've actually met somebody who's directly, well, who's a designated community guard, and you get a sense of what they're doing, you understand it. Like, I mean, there's a sense in which you expect that every guard is a community guard, and that's true to a point. But I would have a concern that if you take the attitude that, from a policy point of view, that every Garda should be considered a community guard. Of course, every guard should be community orientated, and those who are part of core units should be engaged on a, you know, their attitude should be in cooperation with the Gardaí. But I do think that it's a difficulty if you don't have a dedicated community Garda for a sub-district or several across a district or so on, that the certainty of that role isn't there. And that ultimately, while you could have, you know, a general principle of yes, community policing is important, that ultimately, when there is a spike in crime or whatever, and there's, I don't know, public order issues to be addressed in a district, then people are redirected away from this work. And like, as we've all addressed, a huge function of community policing is in crime prevention as opposed to crime solving and building relationships and so on. So I would have a concern on that. Like, I mean, I would be, I suppose I'm open-minded, but I would initially be of the view that you have to have a core of people who are specifically and responsible for community policing in a dedicated way, and that is their primary responsibility, and they're assisted in a general sense by the core unit Gardaí, but that is their primary responsibility. The people in a locality know who to ring, you know, if they want access to the community bus, you know, which I think is something that's very valuable. There's not enough of them. It's a great way to build relationships, that they know who to get onto if they want to organise some sort of a public meeting around a public order issue, that there is a specific contact person and people know who that is. And as I say, we were in my locality, there's two districts in my constituency, the one close to where I'm from, we've had a series of excellent community Gardaí, and what it allowed to happen was that, you know, there was particularly with younger people, there was relationships built up, there was trust built up. And while, you know, other Gardaí might have been known, first and foremost was the community Garda. So I suppose, like, I mean, Johnny, I'd like your observations on that, but anyone else who wants to offer, like, I do think that we could allow for every Garda as a community Garda, and that could cover a multitude, and yet never really cuts to the core of focused, dedicated development of relationships and dedicated community policing. So I suppose that's that question. I suppose more generally, just for yourself, Johnny, I want to ask, do you believe that in recent years community policing is adequately privileged by Garda management, or as has been? I suppose I want to ask in terms of restorative justice. It's a model that we don't have a huge amount of in this jurisdiction, but it's something that's been, I suppose, used more in Britain, in the north, and other jurisdictions. Is that something that we need to see more of, and who's responsible for handling it? I suppose then in terms of local accountability mechanisms, I suppose my experience there is that Garda Fora are the community policing forums, which are, I suppose, a bit ad hoc, are far more effective. I reflect as much in my submission to the Commission. JPCs vary hugely, but like, I mean, I attended meetings of Cork County JPCs as well as Cork City JPC. like, you have a population of 400,000, you're trying to deal with things on a thematic basis. Realistically, all that happens is crime statistics are read out to people and people ask questions. There's no setting of priorities. There formally are policing plans presented, but they're that general across such a large area that ultimately public representatives, community representatives, they don't have enough of a feel of the county as a whole to actually get their teeth properly into it. Like, I think it needs to be much more localised, and that's why I think the community policing fora generally work well, but then that's very localised. My understanding of what's in the Commission is that there is, you know, that you would retain both, but I'm not quite sure I understand what the division of labour that's envisioned in the proposal is, and what would be the job of the joint policing committees, if they're to be retained, if you are putting more emphasis on local policing fora. And I suppose related to that, like, in the north, the PSCPs, I think they're called, the Policing and Social Community Partnerships or something like that, I think they're a fair bit more robust, and I'm wondering, is that a model that was explored at all? And then I suppose just in relation to...
Could we hold at that?
Yeah, okay.
Grand, yeah, come back to you.
Right, okay.
I think you might be flooding the page here now. There's quite a few there. We'll come back
leave it
to
at
you.
that, yeah.
We'll give you another bite at it. Dr. Conley, would you like to open up, and then I'll invite each of the panellists to offer as they feel they wish to. That's it.
Okay, I suppose the question about the dedicated unit or dedicated number, we did discuss that quite at length. My own view is that by doing that, it again marginalises community policing, or the tendency is to marginalise it again, where at present it's around 10% would be dedicated to community policing units. But the real problem here is that we don't have any real idea of the demand on the policing service at a local level. So I think that is something where there has to be a good analysis of the data that is coming in and the demand that is coming upon the local districts before you can make a decision as to exactly how many should be dedicated. But the key part of this is that everyone should be looking towards the community and see themselves as community police, whether they're in a specialist unit or otherwise. And it's not as if that you're looking down on the community police in the organisation, and that seems to be where things are at the moment. So, for example, when you have somebody who is and the key is continuity of service, and the Patten report also acknowledged this over a number of years, that you remain dedicated to this area or location. So if there's a specialist unit that comes in briefly because of some serious crime occurring, and then they are just there to investigate that particular crime, they still must liaise with the guard who is there permanently or on a more continuous basis, who's engaged in problem solving. And that requires continuity and engagement over time. And again, what we know from other countries is that most about 80% of, in the US and in the UK, of issues that are coming to the attention of the police are non-crime issues, mostly to do with vulnerable people. Issues that need interagency working and that need sustained engagement over time. So with restorative justice practice, that's an area I have a lot of interest in, and I think there's huge potential. I think there's a lot of very good things happening with restorative practice. It is being rolled out more, it is being used more, and I think again it fits in very well into the model that we are proposing, because again it's looking at the problem, not necessarily the crime. It's looking at preventive work, and it's looking at engaging over time, bringing people together around, if it's a young person, people that are important in that young person's life, and to help that young person get through this particular stage. So restorative justice, I think, has a lot of potential. There's a lot of people in work I've been doing recently, for example, around drug debt, and other areas such as sexual violence or hate crime. There's a lot of people who aren't engaging at all with the criminal justice system. They aren't going to the police because they don't necessarily want to end up in a prosecution. They don't want to end up in a court case, and even prison doesn't solve the problem if the offender ends up in prison, because the problem can still continue from within the prison. So we have to look at alternative and imaginative approaches, and I think restorative practice have really got a lot to offer in that respect. With regards to just findings, I don't want to dominate with the JPC. Again, from our visits, and we got a number of submissions from JPCs, I suppose to say what probably we're struck was the inconsistency of JPCs. Some were doing very good and novel things in different areas, but the term talking shop was also used quite a bit in a number of submissions. And this presentation of data, we believe that should be something that doesn't need to happen at a JPC. This should all be available. Using modern data techniques, this should be available on the Garda website, data about local crime. So we were more impressed with the local structures, the local community policing structures. But again, you can't be overly prescriptive, because that mightn't be what is needed in a rural area. I have worked with quite a number of them in Dublin City, and they have been extremely effective, dealing with some very serious crime problems, and there is a lot of dedication. But I think there's also huge resources. There's the Irish Farmers Organisation, there's Minton Natira, there's Feroiga, we have the GAA, we have a huge number of organisations throughout the country that I think have a desire and an interest in performing a role in the whole area of community safety that we should be able to tap into.
Would any of the rest of the panellists like to come in, either from Feroiga or Minton Natira? Yes, Niall, please.
Just to follow on what Johnny said about inconsistency in JPCs, I think there is also inconsistency within the Garda structure itself, and that is where community policing needs to be hammered home at the maybe superintendent, chief super level. We see a number of counties around the country operating very successful district and divisional meetings and engaging with the community in a very real way, and Cork is one that does it very well, Deputy. But there are others that I won't name that don't do it at all. So I think that shows where it is in the priority list. And even if you look at the metrics that are commonly reported in terms of numbers of checkpoints and numbers of arrests and numbers of everything, there's never anything about the number of community engagement meetings and so on. So I think that needs to be made more consistent at a higher level. Thank you.
Niall? Yes, Bernie, please.
I'd just like to, I suppose, really agree with a number of the points that were made, particularly around the need for a dedicated community policing service and dedicated roles. What we have found is in areas where there are dedicated community Gardaí, they engage really well with our young people and the families that they work with. But I suppose in some areas there are difficulties and challenges around that, and what they need is the support of local Garda management to protect the time and the space to be able to actually, attend a committee meeting or go to a local youth club or a project and sit with a group of young people and drink coffee and talk about, what the number on their shoulder means, or the more, I suppose we've seen some really wonderful work done with a group of young people who were engaging with the project, and through their engagement we were doing relationship and sexuality programme with those young people, and it emerged as the conversations were happening, it emerged that the staff started to feel that there may be some inappropriate behaviour happening, and immediately after the session, in consultation with their line manager, of course, they spoke to the community Gardaí, who came down in a very informal role as part of that sexuality programme and talked about the legalities and the illegalities of some of their behaviours. There were really positive discussions around consent, and it was a really important learning opportunity for those young people. But had one of those community Gardaí gotten a call to say that a prisoner needs a lift to court that day, that we may not have had that learning experience for those young people. So it's really important that local Garda management support those community Gardaí, and I suppose that kind of echoes some of what has been said here already. Also, there's a really particular skill set that's required for a community Garda. Not every person, and I suppose I'm talking from the youth point of view, not every person can walk in to a youth group or a group of young people and feel comfortable firstly, and actually be able to engage in a meaningful way with those young people. And so we've seen where it's really successful, it's community Gardaí who come in with their prevention hat on and willing to build relationships with young people, and not kind of looking for the crimes, but actually looking for some of the solutions, looking for how they can support young people and vulnerable families. And I suppose there also is a need for a more comprehensive training package for those that are in that community Garda role, because the skills are very different to somebody who might be on a regular unit or in a traffic corps, for example. In terms of restorative justice, we have seen, I suppose, an inconsistency. That's a word that's been used here already. We've seen an inconsistency ourselves in terms of how it operates across the country and where it operates. We've had some very good feedback from young people and families who've engaged in restorative processes with the Gardaí, and would encourage that there was more of that, but in some areas it doesn't happen at all. And I suppose we see that restorative process, when it's engaged in very genuinely on both sides, to be a very kind of fair and equal process, and does have some really positive outcomes for young people and their families, in terms of just understanding the impact of their behaviour on other people. You know, young people can be very impulsive. They're maybe not, do not think about the impact, do not think about the people that they are affecting with their behaviour. And we have found that through various restorative processes that has, you know, I suppose, increased their awareness and had much more positive outcomes for young people. So really, they're just the comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. And before we go back to Deputy O'Leary, I'd just like to say that I absolutely concur with your point in relation to the skill sets.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'd like to record that in my own experience, in my own constituency, that very thoughtful appointments have been made, and the result of that is very much in evidence in my own community, in Monaghan and in Cavan also. So what we need is more of it. Really, that's what it comes to. Deputy O'Leary, please.
Yeah, sure. I suppose I'd agree with that. Like, I mean, it goes to what's in the Commission on the Future of Policing and the treating policing as a profession, and I think this is a skill, the kind of thing that should be privileged. I respectfully, I suppose, like, I take on board the point that you've made, Johnny, in relation to you know, that every, and I said something similar myself, that every guard should view themselves as a community guard and be community orientated. But my concern would be, though, that it's at the other end of the equation, that the community, where there's a good community guard and a functioning structure, has a focal point for contact and for concern and all the rest of it. And it's just not the same if the approach is, well, contact the station and any of the lads or ladies can help you. I don't think that's quite the same. I don't think you, like, I mean, and I'm sure any of them would do their best, but I just don't think that you build up the same relationship as somebody who's, you know, whose primary purpose and function is to be liaising with the community and working with them and developing initiatives. That's my own view, but I'll maintain an open mind on it. Just, I suppose, this isn't so much that anyone needs to respond to it, but just for the purpose even of the report or whatever, I do have a view there in terms of forwards. Notification can be an issue. I think, you know, like, the community as a whole often doesn't know that these are going on. I think, you know, Gardaí and local authorities and whatever need to be a bit better at getting the word out. Just simply contacting the PPNs. The PPNs are great, but they're usually the people who are most switched on to what's happening in community structures and organisations anyway. Won't necessarily mean it gets out to the wider community. Don't necessarily need a response to that. Just a few questions there, I suppose mostly focused on Feroe, and I've one or two of them from internet here. Just I want to ask you, there's an issue there at the minute, I believe, in relation to tendering out of youth diversion projects. Some people have expressed concerns on that, so if you could offer a comment on that. And to ask you, are you happy enough with how juvenile liaison officers and community policing is tied in? And is there, we're not specifically addressing community or juvenile liaison here, but is there more focus needs to be on that? And then just, I suppose, anecdotally, like, I think a huge amount of policing time, especially in urban areas, is taking up with Gardaí being rang to address antisocial behaviour. A lot of the time the antisocial behaviour isn't really antisocial. It's just large groups of young people congregating in places, and then the guards move them on to someplace else, and then somebody else rings the guard station, and the guards move them on to someplace else. And sometimes they can be involved in antisocial behaviour or even criminal behaviour, but quite often they're not. And to be honest, I think a huge amount of time is taken up by Gardaí addressing the fact that really there's not enough places for particularly young people who aren't interested in sport, but people who are between 14 and 16 and 17 and don't really have any place to go besides staying in. So I think that's an issue that we need to address. Like, you know, where do we expect these young people to be if they're not to be at home and if they're not into sport? I think the lack of infrastructure there means that Gardaí are very often just shifting people along and shift them on to someplace else. Now, it's not to dismiss. Sometimes there are real issues and there are real antisocial behaviour and crime, but quite often there's not as well. And then I suppose just to an extent from Muintir na Tíre, I suppose the issue of community CCTV has been discussed in here a fair bit. There are concerns in relation to data protection. Like, I can see both sides of the equation. I can see the value of it and tackling crime as well. I suppose I want to see your own view on how some of those data protection issues might be addressed, if you have any concerns yourself, and how you see that whole scheme working. And then my final question, we got there, Chair, for yourselves as well, is anecdotally, and I suppose I'm mostly focusing on Muintir na Tíre, but anyone who has a view, anecdotally, a massive issue at the minute is the targeted stealing of tradesmen's equipment. That people are, snooping people out and researching online, all that kind of stuff, and targeting in a dedicated, what's often very expensive equipment, and threatens people's livelihoods. So I suppose I'm asking, is that something that you've come across, and if it is, have you any views as to what the solution for that is? Because in a way it's recorded as just a theft, but in another way it can devastate a household.
I'm not going to ask you to respond immediately. Would you please note the points that Deputy O'Leary has asked? It's that Deputy Clare Daly has to leave in a few minutes. She has a delegation coming in at 11, and she wanted to have her questions. She won't be able to remain for your replies, but with Deputy O'Leary's cooperation, I'll take the two together. Deputy Daly.
Thanks to all of you, and I know it can be very difficult for you when we're running in and out, but trust me, your submissions are very important, and we do analyse and weigh up all the points, and as the Chair said, the report is going to be the main body of work for the committee going forward. So I mean, I found it really striking, and I'll play back when I'm gone, but there was a real difference, I suppose, by the vision outlined by Johnny and then the reality, I suppose, and the interactions that are there. And to me, the vision that's been speaking out was a good way to start. And I see merit in what you're saying. The idea of a dedicated sort of 10% there doesn't really work. Our understanding of policing should be to protect and serve the community in all of its aspects, and we need to reinvent that. I was struck by your points about, it shouldn't be about arrest and prosecution. It should be like looking at the whole shooting gallery of how do you best serve a community. So I do think there's a body of work in that. I'd maybe like to know what people think in terms of, you've dealt briefly with restorative justice, but mediation and other areas that could be engaged on in that, and the way in which that could be explored a bit more. In terms of diversion, and again, just very quickly, but the lack of multi-agency connection or inadequate multi-agency interaction, I think, is key. It came up in the section 29s, the Gardaí being called at night, taking kids into care. Generally speaking, the experience is that the Gardaí, and the same in this dealing with young people, are very good, but they don't have the support from the other agencies. I'm thinking particularly TUSLA are being particularly poor in terms of a lack of liaison with the schools and with identifying maybe problematic behaviour, and a lack of support from TUSLA. I wonder, could people explore that a bit more? When a child gets into trouble, the parents are involved, the school are involved, or not really. The school should be involved a lot more. Probation officers, TUSLA, it can get completely messy, and is there views on how that might be coordinated a bit better? And then in terms of sort of specific communities, your opinion on, say, in relation to minority communities, particularly people who are maybe from communities where they weren't born in Ireland, and the issues around language, hate crime, racism, and how those issues are dealt with a bit more. And then just one I was going to say, if each of the groups had a thing, what one thing would make the area of community policing better, or make your community safe, what would that be? That was particularly for Muintir na Tíre on that one. So I'm just sorry for it being rushed. I think it's very thought-provoking, actually, between where we're at and a completely new vision. But that transition, I think, is part of a bigger project of work that we're involved in, but it is about reinventing what do we mean, I suppose, by police. And so I thought it was really good, and thank you very much, and I will be paying attention to the replies, and thanks,
Thank
Chair.
you, Deputy Daly,
Sorry.
and wish your next responsibility all the very best. So I'm going to come back to the panel, maybe just to take them in a different order. Johnny will give you a break. We'll bring you in at the end, and what we'll do is just to take it in a different order, perhaps. If you could take Deputy O'Leary's questions as they apply first, and maybe I'll start with Feroige. If Feroige, Bernie and Caoláin, if you would like to, together in whatever way, respond to Deputy O'Leary's questions, and then to take Deputy Daly's as they would apply to you. Okay. Please, and then I'll go on to Donnchadh Tíre and come back to Dr. Connolly then, please.
So I suppose the first point you were making there, Deputy O'Leary, was in relation to the tendering process for Garda Youth Diversion projects. So when the call for proposal process, which I think is what the official title is, was first announced in January, all of the community-based organisations that manage Garda Youth Diversion projects were extremely concerned. Our major concerns were in relation to the time frame that was suggested. There was a lot of, I suppose, consultation with Gardaí, with community-based organisations, with frontline youth justice workers in relation to it, and I suppose thankfully IYJS have decided to delay that process. So that was a very welcome development for all youth organisations, not just ourselves in Feroige, but I know it was a kind of a universal response. So if for a few months, I suppose it would have caused a lot of concern. We definitely identified the potential for it really to have a wide-ranging and long-term impact if rash decisions were made. The delay is very welcome, and I suppose the process now that's being proposed is a process of research that will happen, that will take place from the end of 2019 and throughout that year and beyond. And that research, we are very hopeful, will actually identify what are the key benefits of a programme like a Garda Youth Diversion programme, what are the things that make a programme like that effective, and I suppose then if it does go out into a process for call for proposals, that the Irish Youth Justice Service will be very clear on what it is that they're looking for and what it is that has the best outcomes for young people. So as it stands, you know, we welcome the decision to delay that process. Then in terms of the juvenile liaison officers, I think you had a general question about our experience with them and whether we're happy. Feroige and all the community-based organisations who deliver Garda Youth Diversion projects work very closely with juvenile liaison officers in the Gardaí. They're an essential part of the system. So the majority of young people who engage in a Garda Youth Diversion project are referred by their local juvenile liaison officer, and in most cases that works really well. They would have very close and effective working relationships in a lot of areas where we have over the years seen, you know, various challenges with working with juvenile liaison officers, and a lot of work happened in 2017 to look at how Garda Youth Diversion projects and juvenile liaison officers could work together in a more effective manner. As a result of a process of consultation and research, a number of guidelines were put together that I suppose really outline what the relationship should look like and how to get the most out of that relationship. What we were finding is where people had, if people had a really kind of strong and positive personal relationship, the projects were operating really well. The projects were getting the right young people referred in a timely manner, and the information flow between the youth justice workers and the Gardaí was really good. You know, people were happy to pick up the phone, have a chat about maybe an incident that had happened and gather information and assess things well. There were some areas where the flow of information wasn't as good and maybe the relationship wasn't as good. When we did the research, what we found was that primarily the issue between the projects and the JLO was simply around communication and understanding of roles and responsibilities. So subsequently, this document, the guidelines that were put together actually break down, you know, what is a youth justice worker's role, what is a juvenile liaison liaison officer's role, and we have found that that has helped improve the interaction and the cooperation at a very practical level within the communities. In terms of feedback from, you know, young people and families that we've worked with, there's been kind of varying responses in terms of how they feel about the Gardaí or the juvenile liaison officer particularly. But in a lot of cases what we find is that a young person will be a lot more positively disposed to the juvenile liaison officer and the community guard where they're present than any other guard that is in the community or in the Garda station. So things are not perfect there. There are a number of other issues we would like to see for JLOs particularly. Again, a more comprehensive programme of training. We have done some work, the GYDP Best Practice Initiative has done some work with the Garda Bureau of Community Engagement in the last few years on developing training specifically for juvenile liaison officers, and that training, you know, every JLO that comes into post receives that training. That training then supports them in understanding what are the issues and needs of a young person who actually is likely to offend, and it, I suppose, helps support them in their decision making around what's the most appropriate response to those young people. So sometimes it is just a very kind of informal response to a young person, or other times it is about going through a much more formal process. But training is an issue, and we would love to see more training, because again, like Community Gardaí, there's a very particular skill set for a juvenile liaison officer, and not everybody is born with that skill set, and it's really important that they're supported. It can be learned, absolutely, and it's important that good quality training is put into place to support them to learn some of those skills. And then the final point that I will address is just around youth kind of facilities. So your comment on they're not necessarily being somewhere for young people to go, and they're hanging around the streets. Absolutely, in some communities there are deficits in facilities for young people. In other communities there are facilities, but the young people may not be aware of it, or other community agencies may not be aware of it. So, you know, we have a responsibility as organisations ourselves to get out there and make sure that that people know that we're there where we are there. But the youth sector is really struggling, and has been for the last few years, because there have been very significant cuts to funding. If you take the Youth Services Grant Scheme, we're down, the initial cut was to 35% of that. There was a restoration of 7%, but we are down 28% in terms of funding from the Youth Services Grant Scheme since in the last number of years. I'm tempted to say 2008, but actually I could be mistaken in that. But we're down 28%. That has had very catastrophic impact on some of our services, and you know, that's just the Ferroiga situation. That 28% amounts to over €700,000 in funding. That sort of money to a charity like ours is massive, and has had serious impacts. We have lost jobs, we have not been able to replace people who've moved on, and all of that means that we cannot provide the frontline services to young people and families who need it and who deserve it. And that's just the Ferroiga situation. There are a lot of other organisations and agencies who have been very drastically hit with those cuts as well.
Thank you, Bernie.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move on now to Minchunatira. Michael, Niall, as you please.
Thank you very much. I hate to move to be heard. Just picking up on a couple of issues. You made reference to the fact of equipment theft, and this is a very real issue in the rural areas, not just for people in industry and work, but on-farm situations as well. There has been a substantive amount of it. It is quite especially targeted in that some of these individuals are able to case out farms, quite detailed casings, sometimes with the use of high technology equipment such as drones, etc. And in areas where there has been a substantive amount of work done on CCTV operations, and I'll let Niall elaborate on that afterwards, there is a structure there to trace and work with that. But that's in very rare situations, and what we are finding on the ground is that where technology enhances the level of security and observation, the level of that crime drops and it moves to the next area and the next area. So that there is a very real issue on the ground, and it feeds into the fear that was referenced in our introduction and the whole isolation issue around that. People know and live in fear that this is likely to affect them, if not now, it's sometime in the future. And oftentimes that provides a situation where that fear extends to not even reporting the crime when it occurs. And we have to be very mindful of that, because a lot of time the full impact and the full level and the full concept of what's happening on the ground isn't being reported. And that affects the level of the quality of the data that we're actually reading into. I'll give you just a very brief example. I spoke to a man recently where he and his family sat in their kitchen eating their evening meal while individuals walked past their kitchen window in their own private yard with dogs going for a walk down through their farm. And the family discussed whether or not they would engage, and they decided not to. Not only that, they decided not to report it to the Gardaí. That's life in rural Ireland. And we must be very, very conscious of what reality is like out on the ground. It's fear. It's fear of what may happen. It's fear of, well, if we do, what will be the next occurrence? And then the frightening part from our perspective, and we all have an element and an input in this, why isn't that individual confident enough that he should report that to his local community or to the Gardaí? Okay.
Is there anything further you'd like to add, Niall, at all? Are you okay?
I would just like to address the Deputy O'Leary's question on CCTV, community CCTV. Community CCTV schemes were being established around the country. It started to take off about 5 years ago, particularly around the motorway junctions and so on, County Laois being a prime example. And the department then introduced the grant scheme for community CCTV and allocated €3 million to it, and perversely that has brought community CCTV to a halt. And as you mentioned, that is an administrative issue over who will be the data controller for these schemes, and the legislation specifies the local authority will be the data controller, but in many local authorities they are not prepared to take on that role, and we're at a stalemate. As to how we get out of there, I suppose there are 3 different types of CCTV schemes around the country. There is community, where the community takes responsibility for the scheme and the data. There are Garda schemes, which you will see more typically in towns, where they have the cameras around the towns and they are monitored in the Garda station. And then you have hybrid schemes, where it's a combination of both. So I think the demands that are in the legislation, even though the Minister has said it's not for changing, I think it needs to be reconsidered and see can we come up with a hybrid solution. Because what is happening now is a number of groups are deciding they're not applying for the grant anymore and they're going to do their own thing. But in doing that, they're also walking away from getting the authority of the Garda Commissioner for the scheme. And that has implications down the road then for the admissibility of evidence of anything that is caught under the scheme. So that's on community CCTV. Briefly on equipment theft, Michael outlined the results of it. A practical suggestion is property marking, marking your equipment with an identifier, because at the moment you could be flippant and say if nobody bought these things, nobody would steal them. But if you can't identify they're stolen, that's an issue. So there are a number of property marking schemes out there at the moment where people can mark their property. And finally, Deputy Daly asked for one thing that might make community policing better. And I think the one thing would have to be at the top. It would have to be a change in priority for community policing at the top level of management of An Garda Síochána. that will filter down if it's given more priority, and that priority must then be measurable. Thank you.
Finally, in this tranche, Dr. Connolly once again.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'd just like to come back to Deputy O'Leary's point about this thing, because again, I've thought a lot about it, about the numbers and the units and the dedicated unit, and I think, I appreciate you said you'd keep an open mind on that one, that I think we require clear demand information as to what is the demand on local services, and then a clear workforce planning programme put in place, neither of which exist at present. And at that point, then you can, with the data in front of you, you can say, okay, well, perhaps talk about a percentage that should be looking to the community and engaging with the community in a problem-oriented way. So I think it is really crucial that, that again, we have a vision for policing with the community, and again, it can't be something that can be just put to the side and not prioritised. The issue of training, again, as part of the Commission's report, we have a huge focus on training. And while I appreciate that there are some people who are really good at community policing, are really good at talking to kids, etc., I think people can be trained for that. And if you are entering into this public service right from the start, you should know that you're going into a community-based service where you must be able to engage with young people, with people with mental health issues, addiction issues, etc. That's central to the idea of community policing, that you are trained and you are prepared to engage at that level, and that is how you articulate a vision on the ground through a professional organisation, properly trained, treating people with dignity, no matter what section of society they come from. Clare, Deputy Daly's points, I think, you know, I was glad to hear her talking about the vision of community policing that we've articulated, because I think the problem is that it has fallen through the cracks, and through the cracks, and that's why you do get a good community guard or whatever, and why you do to get them being pulled away. So I think it's great that we have now articulated a vision of what it would look like in the future. The issue of mediation, I think, again, is really important. Just like with restorative practice, I'll just bring your attention to the Council of Europe is due to publish a large report, International Experiences of Restorative Practice, which should be worth looking at. But again, we do have to look at alternative ways of dealing with what are often problems, and in terms of dealing with prevention. The multi-agency point is central to a lot of what we have talked about in the Commission's report. We've proposed setting up crisis intervention teams, which have been proposed, or I think 2009 they were first proposed, so that it isn't just the guards who are there to deal with people who are vulnerable at 5 o'clock on a Friday. We've also recommended that the Cabinet Subcommittee on Criminal Justice should organise an annual event bringing the various departments together who have a role in the area of community safety broadly, to show that it is a multi-agency function. And the final thing, I suppose, in terms of what is the one thing I would recommend, that is implement the report of the Commission. Thank you.
Good way to finish that particular tranche. I'm going to take Deputy Mick Wallace next, because he's also the jitters, because the Minister, he has to go in to give a Minister some awkward questions. So we'll take you on, Mick.
No, I don't have the jitters. I'm hoping to give them to the Minister, all right. Anyway, thanks very much for your presentations, and they're very good. And without doubt, hopefully by getting them a place in the report that we do, that maybe there'll be more thought around many of these issues, because obviously a lot of this things get said and things then get just left there, and not enough is done. And most of what all the good points you're making, I mean, they remain aspirational until someone is prepared to make changes to how things are done. And I think you all kind of make out that for the aspiration to become reality is going to cost money, and more resources are required in certain areas, whether that's taken from other areas or whether there's extra money required for us to have real community policing. I would imagine that I get the impression that you feel that there is more definitely going to have to go towards the overall budget in the first place. I'm just going to ask two questions, because I'm running anyway. Niall, you were saying that we would like to see increased resources at central level. We'd also like to see a return to each community having an allocated Garda. Do you think that some Garda stations should also be reopened? It would be one of my questions. And the other question, I know some of you touched on it, but don't you think that schools is a massive area of potential in terms of developing a sort of a healthier approach from kids, we'll say, coming from a troubled background? I mean, people you talk about cuts to centres and that kind of thing. I mean, I see 10 and 15 kids in villages in Italy gather around a lamppost or gather around a bench and they don't cause trouble. There's a different mentality, even without, and I'm not saying that they don't have youth centres or anything, right? But would you not think that the schools have the potential? I mean, just my own experience from going to school, I think the school has a huge influence, and teachers and individuals in the school can have a huge impact on how you see things. I know I met some teachers that had a huge influence on me, and it's different from the home thing. Home is obviously the impact or the attitude or the philosophy that comes from home is crucial, but the school is kind of different. And I'm just wondering if you not think, or is that almost asking kind of, is that too aspirational for what works need to be done? So just, I suppose, around the Garda station, because I remember when I was young, we all knew the local guard because we knew where he was as well, right? And obviously he moved around the parish a bit, but he was in the barracks certain hours, and we knew where to get him there, and he was part of the area, part of the community completely. And whereas now, the so-called mobile guard, I mean, I haven't a clue who the guard is around home at the moment, and I wouldn't even be in a position to go look for him if I needed one. So I think that's a huge loss to the community. I don't know, what do you think?
Okay, Deputy Wallace. And Niall, I'm going to start with you because he has indicated the first question for you, and any other comment you wish to offer, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Deputy Wallace. You mentioned resources, and they are finite, obviously, but the Minister has indicated he hopes to bring the force to 20,000 people within the next 2 years, which is a huge increase in resources. So the resources are coming. It's a question of making sure they're allocated in the correct way. And the same principle, I suppose, applies to Garda stations. When resources were tight, they were closed. Now, we would have an open mind on whether you reopen a dilapidated Garda station or whether you provide a similar facility in another community building, if that's available. But you are correct, there does need to be a physical place that you can visit your liaison Garda. The notion at the time was that the Gardaí were better off out on patrol rather than filling out paper, but that is true to an extent, but it's also flippant to an extent. You need a safe place to communicate with the Garda, to pass information, to get information, back to what my colleague said, to be able to have a conversation about what's happening in the community, and that's missing at the moment. You can't have that conversation through the window of a Garda car as it's passing down the street. So yes, there does need to be more. There do need to be more physical locations, whether they're Garda stations or other community facilities. We'd have an open mind on. And just to mention, Feroiga will probably expand on this a lot more, but in terms of schools, yes, I believe you're correct on that too. And good community Gardaí are visiting schools. They're organising events for the elderly, but they're also visiting schools on the other end of the spectrum. But they're few and far between, would be our information on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Niall. And going to Feroiga and Bernie talking about resourcing, I have to say that I thought you made a very well-prepared pitch for additional funding for Feroiga.
Not prepared at all.
And, I was thinking, wouldn't it be great now if the Minister was watching that and the budget coming up next week?
There you go. Thank you very much, and wasn't prepared at all, but just came to my mind. Yes, absolutely. Just to address Deputy Wallace, in relation to your comment on schools, you know, my view is that it takes a village to raise a child. So it's not just about schools, it's not just about the family of origin, it's about all members of a community. All members of a community are should be involved in raising a young people. You're right, there are huge opportunities within the education system to build skills in young people and to inspire and motivate those young people to go on and be very active, positive citizens, to promote civic responsibility, absolutely. Where communities are working well, all community agencies are involved in doing that together. So youth work and schools, the education system, work hand in hand around that. In our experience, in terms of, say, Garda Youth Diversion projects, schools are very much part of the work that we do with young people. They help us assess the risks and needs to young people, and in many cases, education is one of the major risks. So one of the risk factors around offending for young people is non-engagement in school, or negative engagement in school, or early school leaving school entirely. And youth services, statutory services and other services do work really hard with schools, and most schools engage really well, but there are huge other opportunities. I suppose the reality is, for a school, they are constrained by a curriculum that they have to abide by, where the opportunities in terms of youth work and community work is that we can complement the work that happens in school, but we can do it at a pace that is reflective of where the young person is at. So we can respond directly to their needs. We can, I suppose, tailor the programmes or the interventions that we carry out with a young person entirely to where that young person is at and their circumstances that they find themselves in. But I think we all have a role in building those skills with those young people, and that includes the Gardaí and every other agency that's present. Can I just come back to a comment by Deputy Daly there that I didn't address earlier, but I would like to. She, I suppose, posed the question where a young person is in difficulty. What do we do? Who do we go to? And there was the question around multi-agency working or interagency working. Our experience on the ground has been that those working on the ground at the front line, working directly with young people, are very interested and very willing to try to work together when a crisis occurs. But the issue that we have found is that sometimes there's a lack of communication at departmental level, and that has an impact on how we can and do work together. And it has caused a lot of frustrations for frontline workers who can see massive needs and can see that there may be opportunities to work together and support each other, but I suppose that they don't necessarily have there isn't necessarily joint up thinking at a departmental level. So,
and finally, Dr. Conley, please.
I think the point, Deputy Wallace's point about Garda stations, again, I think we have to be quite imaginative about this and look at co-location across agencies or in community centres. There's sometimes there are challenges for people talking to guards or being seen talking or going into a station, for example, in a small village. So I think the importance is that the state has a visibility in the village or in the town. Like the withdrawal of post offices, I think, is a very problematic issue for a lot of communities, because in effect the state is withdrawing from a lot of these communities and the visibility of it. So one of the things about community policing is that it builds on the informal controls that exist already, and as I mentioned earlier, we have a huge number of national organisations that have a place in every single locality, in every village around the country, whether it's the GAA, Mincha Tira, the IFA, etc. And I think they have an important role to play here, and to work with the guards to provide sort of facilities or whatever. But I think that's definitely doable. And also it means that agencies are co-locating across with each other. I think the issue of schools is really, really important. There's just two things came to mind there. I was involved with a project. It was actually Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan who initiated in the North Inner City, where she brought schools together in a sort of a convention. I wrote the report on it, which was called Just Saying, around drug issues. And really, I think the important thing is that you have to get into the space that the young people are at themselves. And they were talking their own language around the drug issues that they were confronting, alcohol issues that they were confronting. And also another piece of work I did on drug debt. Again, the issue of this coming up in schools was constantly a problem, that kids were actually not going to school because they were in debt for drugs, and their parents mightn't have known either. So there's a lot of things happening in school, and school have a role to play in trying to assist young people in getting through and discussing and negotiating these problems. And the final point I would just reiterate is that this point about interagency working. We have, in the Commission report, we've called for, at a ministerial level, for a regular meeting between agencies who have a place in the community safety area, be it justice, be it health, be it youth justice, and that if there are such barriers, it's often to communication or to data sharing, etc., they are resolved at that level. And one of the sort of the strong messages coming out of our report is that we look at policing. We didn't do a report on the police, we did a report on policing. And policing is not just about the guards, it's across all sectors of society. And I think that's and I would hope that that emphasis is something that is reflected in your work too. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Conley. Thank you, Deputy Wallace. We'll be keeping an eye on the Minister now. So our final contributor is Senator Frances Black.
Firstly, I want to say thank you all for the fantastic work that you're doing, working on the front line. And I absolutely love the vision for community policing. My gut tells me the policing service is a long way to go to get to there. But the area that I'm specifically interested in, and Johnny, you've touched on it, is around, I work in the field of addiction, and I feel, I suppose, in the work that I do, and I suppose I just want to get a kind of an idea from yourselves around, how alcohol harm, how drug harm, how gambling even, because I've often worked with families who've had loved ones who, would have broke into houses to feed their addiction, So the role of all of those, and I'm not even going to use the word addiction, because often we kind of put addiction it's over there somewhere. We're talking about society in general, and the role of alcohol harm, the role of drugs, of people who are, who are dependent on drugs, but also those who are just binge weekend, and the impact of that around fights. Now, and I'm talking here around fighting, I'm talking here around, accidents that happen, I'm talking here about sexual abuse, I'm talking about domestic violence, all of those things that happen when we look at our crime situation, rural crime, huge, what drives people to commit crime in general, and what role that alcohol, drug, gambling, plays in all of that. That's the first thing. And the other piece around, I suppose, respect as well, Johnny. You spoke a lot around that, and the policing service. And my belief is that the policing service, are dealing on a daily basis with huge trauma. They're all the time working on the front line. We know there was a report recently about the mental health of the police service because of the trauma, and there's no supports for them there with regard to that. And then all of that trauma again comes back to addiction and the role that it plays. And the reason I'm saying all that to you is I work with families who are living in a situation where they have somebody they love with an addiction problem, and they're living with trauma too, because they're watching that loved one going down that route of self-destruct, and they're living with the chaos and the crisis of it. I know from my experience of working with these families that if you kind of give them the tools to be able to cope with that, and I'm bringing it now to policing service and community policing. If you can give them the tools to be able to cope with that in a way where they're not burnt out, where they're not in that trauma, the results are unbelievable, where they treat their family member with respect but also have very strong boundaries and put things into place that doesn't let that person create the chaos. For example, And again, coming back to community service, I have worked with many different families. I worked with a man who was a grandfather. He wasn't an old grandfather. He was, relatively young, like in his 50s, late 50s. He was rearing his grandson, and they were both living in a house together. And this young lad started to get into some kind of drugs. He wasn't taking it every day, but whatever the drug was, and when he started to get violent, this young lad. And it was pretty scary, and he didn't know what to do. He didn't want to go to the police because this is his lovely grandson. So what he did was, though, he connected in with the help of ourselves. He connected in with the local community guard, and he brought the community guard into his home and sat him down, and the community guard spoke to him and talked to him at length, this young lad, about the impact, and the next time it happens, he was going to be arrested, if there was going to be violence. So immediately there was a shift with that young lad. And thankfully, through a series of lots of interagency work, and this was only this one young lad, the community guard, the addiction services, we supporting the grandfather, that young lad is now in recovery, and it's just a small example of how that multi-agency, that interagency work can work really well together. I have another example of, a sister who was very concerned about her niece. She was only 10 and she was living in an environment of addiction, and she again then went to the community guard, who was absolutely fantastic. Now, these are only small. They gave her support. They couldn't do anything, unfortunately, they couldn't do anything for the 10-year-old child, which was just devastating. But at least there was some supports there. So I suppose what I'm saying is, I listen to the Sean O'Rourke show, and there's Paddy O'Gorman comes on, he's been in the courts, and he's talking, and every single case, almost 95% of the cases that he talks about when he meets people outside or whatever, it's all alcohol and drug related. So I suppose I'm just trying to, and gambling, so I'm just trying to say, I'm trying to, ask you, in your experience around the work that you all do, what role, how high a percentage in the work that you do is alcohol, drugs or gambling play in it? And also, again, and I really hear what you're saying, Niall, I think this has to come from the top when it comes to the Gardaí. It has to come from, the fact that imagine there's only 10% of district policing. I mean, that's pretty shocking. It really, isn't it? When you think of the role, what they could do, bearing in mind that we have to be conscious of the fact that a lot of the Gardaí are already burnt out from dealing with crisis situations all of the time. So, anyway, I'm just asking again, and again, I really loved what you said around the community and understanding roles and responsibilities. And again, that comes back to the training of the Gardaí, but also supports for the Gardaí. Having that support there for them when there is crisis situation. And I just think, the whole overall approach could be absolutely life-changing for the police force, for them in such a positive way, that if it came from the top, instead of having that kind of zero tolerance, lack of compassion, lack of empathy. I've worked in the prison service, and I'll stop now, Ciara, it's just an area that I'm particularly passionate about. I've worked in the prison services, and I've seen, working in the prison services for those women in particular who have come in because of crime, because of drugs or alcohol, which was probably more alcohol than drugs. They would act out in ways that they would never act out if it wasn't for the substance. And when you work in that field and deal with people in a compassionate, respectful way, the results are phenomenal. And, I mean, off the Richter scale, phenomenal. And all of a sudden, they're starting to feel good about themselves, even though, they have acted out in ways where they end up in prison. They start to feel good about themselves, and shame starts to disappear. And, and they start to realise maybe there is hope. So what I'm asking is, I suppose, what in your experience, again, does alcohol, drugs, gambling play a role in crime, and how high is the percentage, and has there been any research done on it?
Well, we start with Veronica then, and the two structures then, and maybe Dr. Conley, maybe you'd like to offer an opinion at the end. Is that okay? So, Verdi, off you go again.
Thank you. So, I suppose in terms of youth crime, what we know is that alcohol-related offences constitute up to 50% of all youth crime. So by that, I don't mean that you'll see drunkenness as, 50% in terms of the youth crime statistics for the country or for particular catchment areas. What you'll see is the likes of assault minor, which was as a result of a young person getting drunk and ending up in an argument and a physical altercation with somebody. You might see the likes of criminal damage, where somebody is drunk and they smash all the wing mirrors on the street as they walk home. Or you could see the likes of theft from shop, where they're either stealing alcohol to drink themselves or they're stealing other items in order to make the money to get alcohol. So up to 50% of all youth crime. In terms then of drugs, the statistics, if you looked at the statistics, there isn't a drug problem among the youth population in this country at all, but we know anecdotally there are pockets where there are huge issues around drug use and substance misuse. For us, one of the major challenges around that is the real lack of under-18 substance misuse services and supports. In some areas, there's absolutely nothing. In some counties, there is nothing. So we have youth workers and youth justice workers who will go and access any training that they can in order to be able to work with a young person. Our area of expertise around substance use in the youth work arena is around education, awareness, prevention. When it comes into the intervention field, there are other professionals who are much better placed to meet a young person's needs. If there is a young person who's actively engaging in substance use to the point where it's beyond experimental and there's the start of a dependence on substance use, really there should be professionals working with those young people. What we have in many communities are youth workers and other community organisations doing their very best to support those young people, because there isn't a service available or there are huge waiting lists for accessing those services. And the other issue that we have is we find that a lot of young people with a substance misuse issue, there's an underlying mental health issue really involved. So you could have a young person who is drinking or using substances to help deal with anxiety, depression, could be just the chaos at home for various different reasons. But we're finding that the community adolescent mental health services then won't work with that young person around their mental health issues because they've got a dual diagnosis of a substance use issue. And you have people then, again, youth workers, I suppose I'm talking about, particularly in a community trying to hold and support a young person and get them to a point where they can engage with a mental health service. And I suppose it's very challenging for those working on the ground. And you had another point, I'm just trying to think. Actually, no, that's it for me.
All right, Verdi. Yeah. Niall, would you like to pick up on those points, please?
Sure, yes, thank you. I suppose the misuse of alcohol and drugs is an unusual one in relation to rural crime, in that it's more of an undercurrent in rural communities. It's not out there in your face street brawls and breaking wing mirrors off cars, because that just wouldn't be accepted in a rural community, and the social mores still have that effect. Now, it may be a factor behind visiting gangs, carrying out burglaries and so on. That's a separate issue. But in the communities, that's not to say that misuse is not there. It is, of course, and it's there in domestic situations like you described. And you're absolutely correct that the community Garda can provide support there, and as I referred to earlier, the good ones do. But I suppose then it's about priority again and focus, because You have specialist drug units set up everywhere with a very clear focus on tackling one end of the spectrum. You don't have that focus in the community Garda's job. It's a by the way. If somebody knows a helpful Garda, they will do the job. It should be part of the job, and it should have equal priority to the enforcement on the other end of the scale.
Thank you, Niall, and back to you, Dr. Conlon, please.
Well, in terms of the links between drugs and alcohol and crime, there is a great deal of literature and research. Particularly the Health Research Board has produced quite a bit in this area, and generally the link is understood using three sort of models. One is the psychopharmacological, which is the product or the quality of the drug themselves that contributes to violence. Now, usually we have huge evidence of associated with alcohol and violent crime, but not so much illicit drug use. However, recently I was invited to talk at an event on benzodiazepine use amongst young people, and the impact this was having on them in terms of them forgetting what their actions, forgetting what they were doing, engaging in violence and forgetting about it the next day. And it was organised by youth workers, and it was a very, very serious issue, and I think it is a very, very serious issue, and again largely hidden often, but the consequences are not hidden, and that is of concern, I think, in this area. The other point that struck me there, we were talking about guards themselves and trauma impacting of their work impact, and then this was something that struck us as part of the Commission. It was a major issue that we confronted, and we did write a chapter on that, on the need for a wellness programme, properly resourced wellness programme within the organisation, and obligatory counselling post-traumatic events. And there is a programme being rolled out in the organisation, but we were very strongly of the view that needs to be resourced very well, and particularly we were struck by the very high suicide rate in the Garda organisation. There was data published on that just before we reported, and also the survey, the Garda survey showed this as well, the sort of issues that were being confronted by guards. But I think one of the things that I think is one of the most positive things from my perspective about the Commission report is that we don't just talk about the prevention of crime, we talk about the prevention of harm and responding to harm. And often harm is due to there being a dual diagnosis, serious addiction issues, trauma in one's family, and we are arguing for a vision. Like as I mentioned earlier, a recent UK report showed that 80% of what the police were interacting with were non-crime events, usually involving vulnerable people with mental health issues, addiction issues, etc. And that is what police organisations are doing on a day-to-day basis, and often they are doing it because maybe after 5 o'clock other agencies aren't around. So that is the reality of police work, and we have put that as central to our work, that people need to be trained in this. The reality is that often guards are the ones left to try and deal with this, and they should be trained and experienced in it, or at least, if not trained, they are close enough in association with other agencies that they can divert people. They understand the signs, and often it could be sexual violence, particularly associated with alcohol, that they initially don't do more harm in their reaction to the victim, and that they have close enough associations with other organisations, be it in the addiction field, sexual violence field, that they can divert people to other organisations. And that is central to what we are talking about in terms of a multi-agency approach. That's really all I have to say.
Thank you very much indeed, Johnny. Thank you for that, and thank you, Senator Francis Black. And our last contributor is Deputy Jim O'Callaghan, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chairman, and thanks very much all of you for coming in. I've read your opening statements, and I know that the committee will find them very helpful in terms of us producing our final report. I suppose I'll just share some of my own experiences with you, because I suppose I'm a justice spokesperson for Fianna Fáil, and as part of that, a lot of my TD colleagues asked me to attend meetings around the country. And actually, I found it a very insightful experience. I suppose a couple of things stand out to me. One is that there's still huge confidence in An Garda Síochána, and people want to see the Gardaí succeed, notwithstanding the problems there has been in recent years in An Garda Síochána. And second, a large number of people come to meetings when there are meetings about community policing or rural crime, and much more so than any other political issues. So I think it reflects that there is a genuine concern and interest there amongst the public. And I think the Gardaí have a good base upon which to build. Every meeting I go to, they say the same thing. They want to see more Gardaí out on the beach. They want to see more community policing, which is what we're referring to here. And I suppose our objective here is to try to see, well, what can we do to give effect to that? How can we make it more efficient? And I suppose primarily, like, how can we get more Gardaí out into the community, doing work that is valued by the community? And sometimes, I suppose, like everyone in this room as a politician goes knocking on doors at people's houses and meets people. And most of them are not that particularly interested in the politician, councillor, but there's a much greater level of appreciation and trust in Gardaí. But in a way, I would like to see a situation where communities would know who their local community Gardaí are, in the same way as they know that Caoimhghín O'Quailon's their TD and Cavan Monaghan or whoever. I'm just trying to think, are there ways whereby that can be done, or maybe there's just too much turnover in Garda Síochána and people move on too promptly. But I don't know whether you've covered this before. What would you feel about there being a separate grade of community guard, and there'd be a separate line of progression for community Gardaí? That's just one issue that you might come back in on. And I suppose another issue is technology. And like, obviously criminality has been hugely enhanced by technology. And criminals use the internet to defraud people, and they use it to identify whether people are out or in. But similarly, peace-minded people and people who want to obey the law can use technology to fight off criminality. And I've seen the Gardaí work in association with people about community watch schemes to try to get a whole area covered by a Garda division, so that people in those areas are on a WhatsApp group or on a community alert scheme. Like, is there anything, and you may have covered it before and I apologise you have, but just in that area as well, is there anything that you think we could make by way of a recommendation in our report to improve it?
Well, I'll take Dr. Connolly first, if that's okay, and I'll just take you each in the order, going to Froga and Macra then, please.
Oh, so well, to deal with the other question first about the community, we did touch on this a little bit in the sense that what the Commission is talking about, a district policing model where everyone is a community police and outward looking into the community, and we've gone into great detail on that. And we had a chat about should there be a community policing unit, and our preference was that at this stage, because we don't know the demand that has been put on the guards locally, and because there is no clear workforce plan, that we didn't put figures on it. And we were reluctant to do it because, again, whereas it's now about 10%, we don't want it again to be put off to the side as if it's irrelevant. With regards to, we also have a chapter on digital innovation and social media, and one of the things we've called for is for mobile apps to be made available to frontline Gardaí, and for the Gardaí to ratchet up their whole social media profile, because in this day and age there is no reason why people should not know the people in their local guard, and there should be regular contact, and there are mobile apps that can facilitate, and we do go into that in quite a bit of detail as well.
Thanks very much.
Bernie, would you like to pick up?
Just in terms of, I suppose, knowing your local guard, that's really important for the young people and families that we've worked with, and we have found that, I suppose one of the comments I made in my opening statement was, in lots of communities where we are present, the community can be fearful or mistrusting of the Gardaí, but the one person that they do tend to trust is the community Garda, because that's the person that's come into their youth club or been at some community meeting, or they've met them on some pleasant trip and they've learned to recognise that community Garda as a person, not just the uniform, because that can be a huge barrier for people. So it is really important that there is some continuity then for the communities where it takes a long time to build up trust with somebody, and if there is that very quick turnover, you're starting from scratch again every time somebody new comes in. So for us, building trust takes time, and whatever supports then can be put in place to ensure that those community Gardaí can be in place or present or visible in the same community, the same area over a longer period of time would be a positive development.
And Niall, my apologies, I knew it the moment I said it. I should have said Wincher rather than Muckra. So no harm done, I'm sure.
Niall, you didn't notice my grimace. Thank you. I suppose to address the two issues, on the community police side, we fully agree with the recommendation that all Gardaí should be community focused. But that's one direction. I think coming the other direction from the community, it is important that the community has a face or two or three to cover a roster, but that they have a contact point that, as Feroiga have said, they can build up trust with. They attend community alert meetings, they attend youth club meetings and so on. That is very important. What's happening at the moment in a lot of areas is the crime prevention officer is becoming de facto the contact point for the Gardaí, because they are going out to meetings giving crime prevention advice. But in a lot of cases, there's one crime prevention officer for a district, for a division, which can cover 2 counties. So that's they're just not contactable. It's not feasible. So yes, we do think that there needs to be a contact point. And just on technology, the Garda Síochána is woefully behind in technology. Everybody accepts that. We see it through the text alert scheme which we operate, as in we are sending out the texts for the Gardaí. And in a lot of cases we have to take a phone call from a mobile phone saying, can you please send out this text called out, because the Gardaí don't have smartphones and don't have internet access in a good number of stations. So where are we going if we don't even have that as a starting point? Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.
All
Thanks,
right,
Chairman.
Deputy O'Callaghan, and thank you for that. And oh yes. Well, you're pushing it today, Deputy O'Leary, but we'll let you in.
I did ask for the topic. Just thanks, Chair. Just moving to Natira there, just in relation to, you talked about marking of equipment and all kind of stuff. Would there be any value in some sort of system of central registration? Like, I mean, it would be voluntary, obviously, but that people, either the Gardaí or somebody else, would maintain some kind of register, because, like, marking is obviously a sensible precaution, but like people might sell stuff. And if the Gardaí go to a market or find somebody that's selling stuff ill-gotten, then it's not necessarily that easy to disprove the fact that, oh, well, that was sold to me or whatever. Would there be a value in some sort of central register that people who have expensive equipment, or the tradespeople or farmers or whatever, that could be registered centrally? If they sell it on, they can contact the register, or if it's stolen, they can say, well, this has been stolen from me. And then, when that equipment is found, the Gardaí can say, well, no, we have a record. This was registered and then it was stolen. Would there be any sense in some sort of a system like that?
Yes, is the short answer. There are a number of registers out there already, but the problem is they are disparate and there is no agreed national database. In Wincher we have looked at this, we have done a pilot programme on property marking, and we might see can we develop it further with the database. There is one in the UK which operates very successfully. The police force is behind it. It's actually sponsored by an insurance company, which makes a certain amount of sense when you think about it, and that operates as the de facto national database. So yes, I think it should be looked at.
Could you send some correspondence on that to the committee, please?
Sure.
Thanks.
Just to come in there, when you use postal code, like, everyone's got a distinctive postal code that isn't being used for much, but if property was going to be marked, it could be marked with an individual's postal code.
If I might just on that, that was the principle we used in our pilot project. The only thing is you have to have a method of recording changes of ownership, because obviously you can sell your chainsaw, so you still need a database to track that.
Okay, fair point. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you for that. And on behalf of the Justice and Equality Committee, I want to thank each of our witnesses this morning. I'd like to thank Dr. Johnny Conley, and thank you very much indeed from the School of Law at Limerick University. You're not the first to be with us. In fact, in these recent weeks, I think one of your colleagues has been with us too. From Feroiga, Bernie, Mealy and Kaylee Canning, thank you both very much indeed, and I hope that the plug for more funding for Feroiga was picked up on. We can do very little about it in Justice and Equality. We have no spending powers, but we absolutely support your appeal. And to Wincher Natira, to Niall and to Michael both, thank you very much indeed for your input to this session. We will be doing a launch of our report later into the year. This is October, it'll be in hopefully before the end of November. We'll certainly let you know of the launch, and it's only if you're in a position to join us for it, you would all be most welcome back at that time. So without any further ado, I'd like to thank the members for their participation also, and the Joint Committee is adjourned until 9 AM on next Wednesday, the 10th of October. Caoimhghín.